More than 500,000 students in Gaza are out of school. But even if the war comes to an end, they won't be able to resume their education. Thousands of them have lost their lives. But for those who have survived Israel's war on Gaza, there are no schools to come back to. Most of the 800 schools have either been completely destroyed or have been turned into shelters for the hundreds of thousands of refugees who have lost their homes. But Raed Abu Taima decided to battle the tide. He turned the library of the Ta'if Male School in Rafah into a classroom.
The idea started during my presence here as a curator of the library. It is known that all schools have, since the beginning of the war, turned into sheltering centers. Children started to flock to the library asking if they could borrow some books or stories. Instead of addresses, I recorded tent numbers in the library's borrowers register. With time, a student named Hamza suggested if they could sit and study.
Teachers are volunteering to instruct these children.
Knowledge is the cornerstone of our future. We must continue with our education in order to be able to build
down
and how it affects our daily lives.
how a problem is global food insecurity.
Counting the cost on Al Jazeera.
For 3 days, this low-lying coastal area in northern Lebanon was inundated when nearby rivers overflowed during heavy rains. Those living here are some of the most vulnerable in Lebanon, where the economy has all but collapsed.
The river's water level reached up to here. Experts say global climate change is leading to intense bouts of rain after long periods of dry weather.
There are several informal settlements for refugees from neighboring Syria in this region as well. Concern is growing among communities living here, near the banks of two rivers, that the worst is yet to come.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. At least one Palestinian's been killed after an Israeli airstrike targeted the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. Gaza's health ministry says nearly 100 Palestinians have been killed in the past 24 hours. In the south, Israeli airstrikes flattened a mosque in Rafah and destroyed at least 4 residential homes. More than 1.5 million Palestinians in Rafah have no place left to go in Gaza. It's day 4 of public hearings at the UN's top court on the legal impact of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. Jordan's foreign ministers told judges there can be no peace until Israel's occupation ends. Well, the conflict in Gaza has been overshadowing a meeting of the G20 foreign ministers in Brazil. Earlier this week, Brazil's president accused Israel of genocide, angering it and its ally, the United States. Al Jazeera's Teresa Bose in Rio de Janeiro for us. So there's a protest going on behind you. What's been happening?
Well, I'm here in the center of Rio de Janeiro, where about 100 people have gathered to show their support to the Palestinian people. They're demanding that Brazil ends diplomatic relations with Israel. And they're also here to support Brazil's President Lula da Silva after his comments comparing the war on Gaza with the Holocaust, stirred a diplomatic firestorm here at the G20 summit, not far away from where I am. It's about a kilometer away. There's the foreign ministers from the G20 and other countries that have been invited by Brazil are discussing relevant issues concerning to the world today. On Wednesday, Brazil's Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira was very critical of the United Nations Security Council paralysis, he said, to try to solve conflicts such as Ukraine or the current war in Gaza. He said that the United Nations Security Council has failed to act on Russia's invasion on Ukraine because of Russia's veto power, also failed to address or call for a ceasefire on Gaza because of the United States veto power. So Brazil has a very ambitious agenda. It is president of the G20 this year. It's focusing on global hunger, sustainable development, but also world governance. That's why Brazil's President Lula da Silva is calling to reform, for example, the United Nations. Maybe we've been told by the Brazilian government expanding the United Nations Security Council. However, this whole meeting has been overshadowed by this diplomatic spat between Brazil and Israel. We know that Secretary of State Antony Blinken flew all the way to Brasilia to meet with President Lula. There they discussed international conflicts in Ukraine, but also Gaza. We also know that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov from Russia is traveling later today to Brasilia, again, to see President Lula da Silva. So this has been a meeting in a way with lots of divisions that shows the enormous differences that exist right now in the world agenda, the inability to solve many of the problems in the world today. And what we're seeing is that it is unlikely, for example, that we're going to see a final statement, that it's something that's very normal in international summits such as this one. There's not going to be apparently a final statement from the foreign ministers here in this meeting for the G20, mostly because of lack of consensus among member states.
Teresa, thank you very much indeed. Teresa Bo talking to us from Rio de Janeiro. Jordan's foreign minister has rejected the U.S. assertion that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is a bilateral issue. Ayman Safadi told Al Jazeera that the International Court of Justice has grounds to rule on the matter.
Today, Ireland, Ireland, Japan, Jordan all argued that there is legal ground for the case to issue an advisory opinion. It did so in the case of the wall in 2004. It did so in the cases of many other countries. So there is legal precedence, there is legal ground. The court is within its competence to speak on this matter as requested by the General Assembly, and as many lawyers have argued, the court cannot take away that right from the General Assembly to seek that opinion. I think what matters is that, as I said, most countries are speaking in a very clear legal and political language that occupation is unlawful and it must end. And again, we in Jordan have emphasized the danger inherent in the continuation of this occupation. We also, of course, address the issues of the minute, which is the barbarity of the war with which Israel is attacking Palestinians right now, causing the death and destruction and of the livelihood of millions of people. That has got to stop. This is our message. The only path to peace is, again, the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Israel is not doing that. It has to be held accountable. Officials behind the war crimes that are taking place in Gaza now need to be held accountable and need to face justice.
Ukrainian forces have reportedly killed at least 60 Russian soldiers in an attack on the southern Kherson region. It's the second time this week the Ukrainian army's announced its operations caused heavy Russian losses. On Tuesday, it said dozens of Russian soldiers were killed in the Donetsk region. That's where Russia took control of the frontline town of Avdiivka last week. Rob McBride is in Dnipro with more.
These are being claimed by Ukraine as two significant strikes against Russian forces, apparently involving, according to Russian sources and Russian bloggers, these very precise long-range HIMARS missiles that Ukraine has been using and has used effectively in the past as well. The first strike is said to have taken place in Kherson. This was just yesterday, when drone footage appears to show a group of soldiers gathering. It's thought that they were from some sort of airborne brigade. explosion happening amongst them, resulting, according to Ukrainians and also to Russian bloggers, it's been confirmed by them, scores of deaths and injuries. And this was just a day after a very similar strike happened in the eastern Donbass region. Again, according to clips on Russian media, Russian social media, it was two companies, the soldiers being brought together under very similar circumstances, a direct strike apparently from a missile. And this comes as Ukraine is also claiming victory in the air. It says that in the past week or so, it has shot down 7 Russian jets, which is a relatively high number. And the Ukrainians have been looking at its air as a way of trying to shift the dynamics in this war. Everybody's expecting, of course, the arrival of F-16 fighters over Ukrainian skies, if that will make a difference. And it does come as things seem to be stalemated on the ground. And if anything, moving in Russia's direction with its capture recently of Avdiivka.
US President Joe Biden has endorsed Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte to be the next head of NATO. Rutte, also backed by the UK, would succeed current NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. He would take charge as Finland and Sweden are added to the alliance. Ahead of the US election, another challenge for Rutte is going to be dealing with the different views on NATO of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. People near the eastern city of Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo are fleeing as M23 fighters advance. Violence is intensifying, prompting the UN Security Council to sanction some of the group's leaders at an emergency meeting on Tuesday. Catherine Soy reports from Goma.
This is not the first time Deborah Balole has had to flee from her home. She lived in a village that was taken over by M23 fighters in November. Then she went to the town of Sake in the eastern Congolese province of North Kivu, where she thought she was safe. Her husband was killed a week ago during violence between government forces and the fighters in the area. A bomb had hit their home. She's now living rough in a nearby camp for the displaced. She says there's no one to protect them here.
I went to the forest to look for food for my children a few days ago. I met bandits who took my supplies and they raped me.
Nearly everyone from Sake is sheltering at the camp that was already overcrowded. 1.5 million Congolese have been displaced since this latest round of conflict 2 years ago.
A week ago, this camp was not here. More and more people are coming from Sake. They are building these structures. They say they have nowhere else to go. That there is Antoinette Buhinga, and she says that she has been sleeping out in the cold.
We are always running. We don't get rest. I don't know what to do. I'm just praying for peace.
The battle for Sake has been intense. A coalition of government forces wants to push M23 fighters farther away from hills near Sake. The town is an important route into Goma, the provincial capital. Back at the camp, Deborah and Antoinette say they are doing what they can to survive day by day. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera, Goma, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Sudan's army is broken a siege by the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces on one of its bases near the capital. 10 months into the conflict, the army is slowing
For nearly 7 months, it was under siege by the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. But in recent days, the army was able to break through and deliver supplies to its troops.
This is a gift from God and a defeat of the rebels and criminals who terrorized people and carried out atrocities like never seen before. This is the first phase. The war will not end until Omdurman and all of Sudan is cleared of the militias.
The base are by the back fought over it. Destroyed by artillery fire from the RSF when it tried to seize the base. Barriers built on roads to keep the fighters away. The paramilitary group has been fighting the army for control of Sudan for 10 months. Its fighters were stationed in districts surrounding the base to prevent weapons and ammunition from reaching the soldiers inside. But in the past few weeks, it's been forced to retreat from some areas. The army has made gains here in Omdurman, but artillery shelling by the paramilitary on the base and the areas around it continue. And while the military was able to bring in reinforcement, it wasn't the only side that was affected by the RSF and its blockade. Fathur Rahman Mohammed lives near the base. After days